All right, everyone, it is 11:02, so I think we can get started. There's still some folks coming in from the lobby, but welcome to the Science Communication Webinar for July. If you haven't done so already, can you go ahead and mute yourself? Hearing a couple of noises in the background. Just make sure you're muted so that we can let Kelsey and Catherine have their say and everyone can hear them. So just keep yourselves on mute, and if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end of the talk. So today we have Kelsey Roberts, who is the Piedmont Fisheries Research Coordinator, and Catherine Jewell, who is the lead social scientist here at the WRC. And they're going to be talking about a project titled Let's Tackle This Together, Incorporating Social Science into Fisheries Management. I think Kelsey is going to kick it off first, and then again, we'll take questions at the end.
Great, thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Catherine and I are excited to talk about a project that we worked on together. And the main, goal of this talk today is just to highlight how we use social science to inform some of the management decisions, specifically how we used it to create a management plan for one of our stocking programs. So just give a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. I'll give a little bit of background on the species we were working on, what our management goals were, how we designed and implemented the survey, what the results were, and then how we incorporated those results into our management plan. So the two species that we were creating management plan for were striped bass and Bodie bass. Typically, I think when most people in North Carolina think of striped bass, they think of the coast, but striped bass have been stocked throughout the state beginning in 1949 in reservoirs. So when they live in reservoirs, they don't get as big as the ocean fish typically, and they only live to be about 4 to 7 years, but they have really fast growth. The Bodie bass is a hybrid, is an artificial hybrid between white bass and striped bass. So Bodie bass is just what we call hybrid striped bass here in North Carolina. And we began stocking those in reservoirs across the state beginning in 1977. And they have a similar lifespan to striped bass, but they typically don't grow quite as large as striped bass in reservoirs, but they can tolerate a lot warmer temperatures. So there's advantages to using, the different species depending on where you stock them. So the striped bass and Bodie bass stocking program originated as a way to create opportunities for folks across the state to be able to fish for striped bass without having to travel all the way, to the coast. And it created these unique opportunities for anglers across the whole state. And then it kind of evolved into also stocking Bodie bass as well. And the thing about these fish is that they don't naturally reproduce. They typically don't naturally reproduce when they're stocked in reservoirs. So these populations are reliant on our hatchery systems to annually stock them every year to maintain the populations. So this is what we in fisheries management typically will call put, grow, and take fisheries. We put them in the water, they grow, and then theoretically anglers take them out of the water. So all of our striped bass and Bodie bass are raised and stocked from the Watha State Fish Hatchery. And currently we have 11 reservoirs where we stock striped bass and 6 reservoirs where we stock hybrid striped bass across the state. So once these fish go into the water, we don't just, let them go and wish them luck. We typically will monitor these populations. We typically will monitor these populations and adjust our management based on what we're finding from our surveys and also what we know about the physical characteristics of, that particular reservoir that they're going in. So we have a lot of information on habitat and fish, but we were missing this key aspect, which is how the anglers are using these fisheries. And even though we've been stocking them since the 50s and the 70s, until recently, we didn't have a cohesive management plan, and we had never specifically, surveyed just Moroni, which is striped bass, Bodie bass, the family that striped bass and Bodie bass are in. We never specifically surveyed the Moroni anglers to see how they were utilizing. So, going into this management plan, we had a lot of questions. How are the anglers using these fisheries? Are they happy with the fish that we're stocking? Are they happy with the locations that we're stocking? Do they even know that we're stocking these fish? What do they want? Like I said, we had so many questions. So our overall arching goal was to create an angler survey and utilize their angler opinions to inform management decisions in general, but also it was really geared toward helping us design and implement this reservoir striped bass and Bodie bass management plan. And the goal was really to evaluate, use this information to evaluate our resource allocation so that we could improve efficiency and satisfaction with it, of the stocking program. But we liked the idea of this angler survey because it allowed us to connect with our anglers and better understand our constituents for this specific fisheries.
All right, thanks, Kelsey. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we designed the survey and how we did our implementation or our data collection, and then start off the results discussion. So first things first, we collected data via a survey or via a questionnaire. So we hosted it online on Qualtrics, which is our typical survey platform, but we also used the modified tailored design method, which I'll get into a little bit more in the next slide. For data analysis, we ran descriptives and chi-squares, and we used thematic analysis for qualitative analysis. And we also did an economic impact. So we used the in-plan input-output model to do so. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so with data collection, like I said, we used a tailored design method. This is something we've been doing in a lot of our surveys recently. So first things first is we sent an initial email to 25,000 anglers. We also then sent up a follow-up reminder email to non-respondents a few days later. And then we mailed 23,000 letters a couple weeks later to any of our non-respondents, and these letters had a push to web. So we included a unique survey identifier code and a QR code and a link to take the survey online. Then we had another reminder email to non-respondents a couple weeks after that. And then finally, we mailed 19,000 full survey packets to non-respondents a couple weeks after that. So in doing so, that allows folks to answer in any given way they choose via answering their emails or through the push to web or through the full survey packet if they chose to. And we ended data collection in December. All right, so all in all, we heard back from about 6,500 people. And this was a 26% response rate, which I was thrilled by. Survey response rates have been historically declining, and 26 was awesome. So when you think about the respondents overall, 37% answered it via the email, but 47% did it online, but through our mailed distribution method. So through the letter or the survey packet had a QR code and a link on it as well. And only 900 folks answered the full paper survey and 84% responded online. So next slide, yeah. So with all of our surveys that we're trying to get a population estimation from, we market them as a generic survey. So in this case, it was a generic fishery survey, help inform fisheries management. So the first question that we asked was, what species did y'all fish for? So we had crappie, panfish, black bass as our top three. And then that 26% of striped bass and Bodie bass was how we started to begin our population estimation. So next slide. So that was about 1,800 people who said they fished for striped bass and hybrid striped bass, which is what we used on the survey because not every angler knows that it's called Bodie bass in North Carolina. But again, like Kelsey said, they're found both in lakes and reservoirs and in our coastal rivers. So to dial down specifically to that lakes or reservoirs group, we asked them where they fished for striped bass and hybrid striped bass and Bodie bass. So you can see that 72% of those individuals, or about 1,300 people, fished specifically for striped bass or hybrid striped bass in our reservoirs. Next slide, please. So all in all, taking that percentage of people and looking at our total licensing database, we estimated that there's about 260,000 striped bass and Bodie bass anglers, specifically targeting them in lakes and reservoirs. And I'm going to go over economic impact really quick. So we asked them how many trips on average they took per year. And on average, these trips can be a day or multiple days. But on average, they took 13 trips a year. I mean, this is some people that only go fish for it once. There's a couple people who I'm sure do it hundreds of times. But on average, spent per person per trip, it's $127.27. You can see the table on the slide, how that ends up breaking down when extrapolated that to the larger population. And it's important to note, this is a pretty conservative estimate of expenditures. This is just talking about your trip expenditures. This isn't talking about the equipment. So not your boats, not your rods, not your reels. This is just your basic, what are you spending on one day trip to go out? And this may be higher than a lot of you all are maybe thinking. And that's because some people have to travel, you know, the travel to fish adds up really quick, especially if you have to stay in a hotel. So all in all, that 430 million expenditure number, when plugged that into the in-plan output-input model, we can estimate that just on striped bass and Bodie bass trips, fishing trips in lakes and reservoirs per year, brings a total economic impact of $491 million to North Carolina. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kelsey.
Right. So now I'll go into angler use and awareness results. From our survey, we could tell that most people who are fishing for striped bass and Bodie bass in reservoirs are male, white, and not Hispanic. And even further, most of them are between the ages of 55 and 75 years old. So even though we have the stocking program that is spending money to distribute resources across the entire state, it's only being utilized by a very narrow demographic range. And so this, was a pretty easy recommendation to get from these results, is that we need to expand, who we're targeting to recruit anglers from a wider demographic range. One of the questions we asked was, of the people who were fishing for striped bass and Bodie bass, did you know that the commission were the ones that stocked these fish? And this was probably the most surprising answer for me out of the entire survey, is that only, about half the people were aware that the commission is doing these stockings, and the other half were not aware. So our management recommendation from this result is that we need to increase awareness. And one thing we gleaned from this survey through other questions was that, increasing awareness is important because it contributed to satisfaction. So people who were aware of the stocking program, who fished for these species, were more likely to be satisfied with the program. The more satisfied anglers are, that helps to, not only recruit, but also retain our current anglers. And, if people are more aware of what we're doing, it improves communication and our relationship with anglers as well. We can also use the survey to guide how we want to, distribute information, how people prefer to receive information. So we asked that question, and the top 3 results were the Commission's website, the Regulations Digest, or brochures like handouts, and then NCWRC emails, so the listserv emails that we send out. And this question can be further broken down into the different demographics. So we can tailor how we target specific age classes or genders. And for example, people over 75 years old preferred to receive information via emails or the regulations digest, whereas people under 35 preferred website and social media. So that it just helps us kind of work toward our goal of increasing awareness by being able, and our other goal of increasing the demographic that we're reaching. And then, one surprising result from this question was that prior to this, our primary communication mode, was the biologists going out to striped bass or Bodie bass fishing clubs and presenting on the information, presenting on our surveys. And what we found is that mode of communication is down here in the bottom 3. And through another question, we found that, out of the thousands of people that completed this survey, only 1% belonged to a fishing club. So the way we were previously communicating, we now know is not as effective, not as efficient. It still has value and it's still important. But from this survey, we're able to, maybe improve how we communicate in the future. We also asked them to list the lakes that they had fished for striped bass or Bodie bass for in the last 12 months. And then we had them rank them. So this gives us an idea of which lakes are popular. And this is important because we can combine it with our biological information to make decisions. So, for example, if we have a lake where it's really difficult for us to get our hands on fish, or the fish that we're seeing, maybe we're not catching very many fish, or they don't have great body conditions, or they just don't look good, but it's, let's say that lake is one of these top 3 lakes. Well, when combined with the angler opinion results, whereas before we would have gotten rid of stocking that lake, now we would say, okay, well, people are utilizing this, so maybe there's a disconnect and maybe we need to improve how we're sampling this lake. On the flip side, if let's say we weren't catching very many fish at a lake and then that lake came in the bottom 5 lakes or something like that, then that would give us the confidence to say, okay, we're not catching fish. Anglers don't like this, spot. So let's go ahead and take that and redistribute our resources. So one part of fisheries management, one tool that we use in fisheries management is to adjust our regulations. And so obviously we were interested in whether or not people were mostly catching these fish and releasing them or harvesting them. And what the results that we got were about what we expected. But it also would have told us, let's say if folks were mostly harvesting striped bass, but not Bodie bass, it would tell us that we would need to adjust the regulations for one species and maybe not the other, or maybe it needs to be more like specific. It just kind of gives us an idea of how to adjust our regulations. And I think what we found was that, based on these responses, most people are practicing catch and release, so we're not too concerned with our current regulations there. But in addition to interviewing people who do fish for these species, we didn't let the people who didn't fish for them off the hook too easily. We wanted to know why they weren't fishing for striped bass or Bodie bass. And one of the the top responses were that they fish for other species or they don't target specific species. So they're, generalists. And something that stood out to me as a manager is that the second most popular answer was that I don't own a boat. And so to me, that says that there's this perception out there that you need to own a boat to be able to fish for striped bass or Bodie bass. And while the majority of folks who do fish for these species own a boat and they use a boat to go fishing, and bank angling is a lot less popular for these species, there are ways that we can, kind of break down this barrier. We can stock these fish in smaller lakes that have, piers or bank access. We can improve some of our riverine bank access areas for tributaries that go into reservoirs, so that when these fish are making their, fall spawning run, um, people can angle for them on the bank in these reservoir systems. So this was interesting and definitely something we took into consideration in the management plan. We also asked them specifically, is there anything we can do to make you want to fish for these species? And the top answer was no, there's nothing you can do. So that, makes our job easier. But the second and third options were to stock locations near me and to have updated information on stocking locations. So this tells me that, a recommendation from this would be that we need to kind of reevaluate where we are stocking these fish in proximity to our population centers. And then, we need to improve how we're distributing our information. Okay, so satisfaction is important, like I said, to retain anglers. And when we asked them how satisfied they were with the stocking program, 66% said they were, neutral, somewhat satisfied, or very satisfied. So that tells us that we're doing a pretty good job, but that there's slight room for improvement. So one of the questions that we asked along these lines was, we had a list of factors that could negatively impact their fishing experience, and we had them rank each factor on whether it would have no impact on their fishing experience, a minor impact, a moderate impact, or a major impact. And I combined the moderate to major impact to get these percentages here. So the number one thing that would have a moderate to major impact is that they go to a lake and there's not enough trophy fish. So they want bigger fish. Or the second most common response was that the lake that they went to expecting to find striped bass or Bodie bass did not have striped bass or Bodie bass. So I can understand how that would ruin, your fishing trip. The third option was not knowing how to find which lakes are stocked. And then lastly, that the fish that they caught were too small. So, as we're going through all these responses, you can kind of sense a theme here that people want to catch bigger fish, and they want them to be closer to them, and they want to know how and where to find these fish. Okay, so the last question that we'll cover today is, we gave them a list of factors that were motivation factors, and then we had them rank them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being for importance and satisfaction, 1 being that they are not satisfied at all, 5 being that they're super satisfied, and then for importance, 1 being that motivation is not very important to them, 5 being that it's very important to them. And we can plot all of these factors on what's called an importance satisfaction matrix. And it does look kind of busy, but the most important thing is that there's nothing in this upper left quadrant. So this upper left quadrant would be factors that are really important to people, but that they are not satisfied with. And so we didn't have anything there, and that's a good thing. Most of the responses fell on the right side, which means that, it ranged from importance of between 1 to 5, but that they were mostly satisfied with all of these factors. The one thing that, fell just outside of that is catching a trophy fish. So again, they want to catch bigger fish. But even then, it wasn't, terribly bad. They have basically that's an average importance to them, and they feel meh about it. They're mean satisfaction on it. But if we were to improve anything, that would be, something that we would look to improve. Okay, and I lied. I have one more slide to talk about. So we asked them directly, what would make them more satisfied with the stocking program? And most of the responses, surprisingly, instead of saying they wanted big fish, more locations, the number one answer was that they wanted more information on stocked locations. And this is a good thing because this is something that's completely within our control and something that, will be a management recommendation moving forward. So it comes back to this awareness piece. We really, really need to focus on raising awareness for this stocking program and providing better information to our anglers. Um, the next two were stocking new locations and stocking more fish. So those are, that's what you would expect. In another question, we dove a little deeper and asked if they were, if they were satisfied with the program and if they wanted the program to move in a different direction. And with that question, we were mostly interested in whether people preferred striped bass versus Bodie bass. And what we found was that a third of people were satisfied with the program. They didn't want to make any changes. And a third of them said they wanted more striped bass and less Bodie bass. So there is a slight preference for striped bass amongst our anglers, and less so for Bodie bass. Okay, so from all of this information, and we left a lot out, but we gained a lot of information from the social survey that we used for our management plan. And some of the recommendations, to sum everything up, are that we need to increase awareness, we need to improve how we're distributing information, we need to focus on recruiting new, younger and more diverse anglers. Something we can do is evaluate our stocking locations and how they're spread out throughout the state to see if we need to kind of redistribute where our resources are going. And then, consider maybe adding a trophy bass fishery or changing one of our fisheries to become a trophy bass fishery. Um, Consider stocking, an additional lakes with striped bass. And then, of all of the reservoirs that we stock, we use these results with our biological data to come up with management recommendations for each individual reservoir. So with that, I just want to thank everyone who was involved, everyone on the management committee who helped, formate this survey, the hatchery personnel who were, super involved as well in the management plan. And then obviously the survey takers, like Catherine said, we had a lot of respondents, so I was really happy about that. And with that, I will open it up to questions, and I'll leave this slide on here of a poem that someone submitted on our survey. So happy to take any questions if you have them.
That was great. Thank you so much, Catherine and Kelsey. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I can call on you. Otherwise, you can drop them in the chat. But for now, I will start us off with a question for Kelsey. So how did the results from the survey kind of compare to what you all were seeing on the ground, and getting comments from anglers as you were out and about? Did you find anything shocking or really surprising or kind of contrary to what was maybe working knowledge?
I would say that we had a pretty good idea of what to expect, as far as like demographics and, most people using boats and where people like to fish. I think, the W. Kerr Scott Reservoir kind of rose to the top there, and that was maybe a little surprising to me, but that's mostly because I'm in the Piedmont, so I don't I don't always hear of people going out there, but we found out that that was a very important lake. I would say the most surprising thing is just that people don't know that we're stocking these fish. And I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that. So um, that was an interesting result for me. But in general, most of our biological data matched up with what we were seeing as to like where people like to go fishing. Some of the which was good because it made our decisions easier.
Awesome. All right, we have a question in the chat from Heather. She says that was an impressive number for economic impact just from striped bass and Bodie bass fishing. Do you have any idea what the number is for economic impact of fishing as a whole?
Yes. So we did, I don't know the number off the top of my head. Christina probably does because she was the one who did the project. But we did do a economic impact analysis of fishing as a whole a couple years ago. And we're potentially scheduled to do it again here in the next couple years. So I will let her pull up that specific number. Some examples of other species we've done. An example of other species, trout was over 1 billion, and it's looking like largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, Alabama and spotted will be over 2 billion. So 5.8 billion is fishing as a whole, roughly.
Yeah, to Catherine's point, we did a study a couple years ago that we'll be redoing again in a couple years, where we measured the economic impacts of hunting and fishing. And the economic impact of fishing across the whole state was $5.8 billion. So there's a lot of economic impact when it comes to recreational activity, especially when it comes to fishing. Just because there's so many people out there doing it.
And that was residents only, right, Christina?
Yeah. Since we have some more time, I've got one more for Catherine, or Kelsey, if you want to have any input as well. When looking at the participation numbers that y'all developed for this study, how does like striped bass and hybrid striped bass fishing compare to other types of fishing in North Carolina? Is it one of the more popular activities, or are there other ones out there that trump it?
So looking at the results from this project, and I quickly looked at a couple other of our projects as well. Reservoir striped bass and Bodie bass isn't our top fishery that folks are fishing for. I mean, most folks are fishing for, like I said, our black bass species, largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, Alabama spotted, as well as both species of crappie, the whole suite of species in panfish, and then also all the catfish as well. So those are a little bit more popular. But I will say reservoir striped bass and striped bass more and hybrids as a whole are kind of aligned with mountain trout, actually. So it's an important fishery from that aspect, but it's also not the most niche group of species folks are fishing for as well.
Oh, great. I don't see any more questions in the chat, or I don't see any hands up either. So I think we can call it in terms of questions, unless anyone has any last minute ones they want to get out. But yeah, thanks so much to Catherine and Kelsey for this presentation. Everyone else on the call, next month, we have a talk on the wildlife side of things. The presentation is Deer Ecology Across an Urban-Rural Continuum, presented by Ashley Lynn, Micaiah Carver-McGinn, Jared Lamb, and Hannah DeRoche. So please tune in next month for that science communication webinar as well. And thanks again to Kelsey and Catherine.
Thank you.